Okay. By way of a recap last week, welcome everybody, first of all. Last week class, we covered the purposes of the waters of the Great Deep. So as we have been discovering or discussing during creation, water is trapped beneath the crust, deep below the surface of the earth. And this becomes the fountains of the Great Deep that burst forth that we'll be starting to talk about here. But there would have been some purposes to this water before the flood occurs, I think. And so we kind of talked a bit about that. What would be the purposes of these waters pre-flood? And so God doesn't do anything without a purpose behind it. So I think there was a purpose in that this motion of that crust, because of the moon's gravitational influences on the earth, would have caused that crust to flex a bit, causing heat, because as we see movement, use the coat hanger analogy, you bend a coat hanger a few times and it starts to heat up at the bend. The crust would have heated up a bit too, and some of this water that was in this deep subterranean chambers would actually have heated to a point where it becomes a fourth state of water called supercritical water. And we'll discuss that a bit more as we go into the class as well. But this fourth state of water contains a huge amount of energy. So we have water in the liquid state as we normally have it, above 32 degrees, but below the boiling point of 212. And it exists as ice below 32 degrees, and it exists as vapor. As it gets above a certain temperature, 212 degrees, it becomes of gas or a vapor. So this fourth state of water is basically a point where the water becomes what's called supercritical. It's basically a half gas, half liquid arrangement. It happens when the temperature reaches 705 degrees Fahrenheit and over 3,200 pounds of pressure, or PSI. And so it enters into this state called supercritical. And the supercritical water can be shown to have occurred because of the tremendous heat and pressure that would have occurred deep inside the earth. We also discussed that supercritical water also has chemical, uses and commercial uses, like it's used to decaffeinate green coffee beans, for example. So your coffee fans should be, aware of that. And then also it can be used to break down or oxidize waste products like pollution, certain types of sewage, for example. So that's kind of where we left off. So we've got to the point now where we're now going to start discussing the beginning of the flood itself. And this occurs, of course, and is recorded in Genesis 7, verses 11 and 12. So this is the beginning of the Great Flood. This marks day 0. We'll have a timeline that we'll go through as we go through all this, where we'll see certain effects or phases of the flood that occur at certain times during the flood. We'll have a timeline of this. So we'll use scripture for that. We'll also use the Hydroplate Theory's phases that we'll go through as well. So this passage reads, in the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, on that day all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened, and rain fell on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. So just prior to this passage of Genesis 7, we see that God instructs Noah and his family to enter into the ark with the animals that would be preserved or saved from destruction during the flood. He's instructed to take 7 pairs of every clean animal, male and female, and 1 pair of every unclean animal, male and female, because in 7 days, it states, I'm going to send 40 days and 40 nights of rain upon the earth in order to wipe out from the face of the earth every living creature that he has made. And we're not told too much more about this, but Leviticus 11 does tell us the difference between what are called unclean and clean animals. Noah, of course, lived before the giving of that law, but we're not told how Noah would know which animals are clean and which are not. Perhaps God just brought it to him that way, or he probably knew. He probably knew the difference. And then in verse 11, we see the actual happening of what was promised in Genesis 6, and then in the early verses of Genesis 7. So this time of judgment has now arrived. And the exact date is recorded here as well. This is pretty significant. It was the 17th day of the second month. So down to the day the month and the day, we see the dating of the flood. So this raises the question of just what calendar was in use at the time. And it was probably impossible to be sure exactly what calendar was in use at the time. But since all scripture is divinely inspired, there must have been an actual date recording this according to a particular calendar, although it probably wouldn't have been written this way. There must have been a specific reason to have recorded this date with such precision. But our logical assumption would be based on the confirmation of the amazing accuracy of Scripture, where it can be verified over and over again that what is recorded and happening in Scripture actually really happened. And over so far we've seen that Scripture is so accurate that it can't be by chance. It all points to a divine hand behind all of this. So it's a significant day in history, of course. Today, we mark significant events in history, such as July 4th, the Independence Day, when our Declaration of Independence was signed. And we also now, unfortunately, recognize September 11th, called Patriots' Day now, in observance of the attack by U.S. terrorists in 2001. Or, of course, December 7th is what? Pearl Harbor Day, right? This was the date that Japan attacked the U.S. in Hawaii. And numerous other days are significant throughout our history, but this day of the 17th day of the second month, should be another significant history date that we remember. So it's known that the Jewish civil year began in late fall, as many other ancient calendars presumably did, to correspond with the agricultural harvest times. And also Jews attempted to base their calendar on the date of Adam's creation. Therefore, the most natural interpretation of this day will be in correspondence with the creation week. If this is the case, the most simple conclusion would be that the flood came to the earth about 1,655 years, 1 month, and 17 days after creation. We can't be sure of that, but it kind of points to that. This, of course, points to the assumption that the dates in Genesis 5 where each son is named and they were born on the day of when they were born would have been on the exact day that the birthday of the father happens, but of course that's probably unlikely. So, but it gets us close. At least it gets us pretty close as to when the date of the flood was after creation. So even though we can't be sure of the exact date, we can be sure that this is when the springs of the great deep, or the fountains of the great deep, would burst forth, the floodgates of the heavens would be opened. And the geological implications behind this are enormous. And it's both vital for us, both scientifically and biblically, to determine at best what these statements mean. And once again, as we see throughout Scripture, very few words contain a very deep range of meanings, a very large amount of meaning in just a few words. It's amazing how God does this. I mean, just read Genesis 1:1 and you'll see this. I mean, it states the beginning of the universe and everything in it, the beginning of time, the beginning of matter, the beginning of space, in one verse. I mean, it's really impressive how that's written. We'll spend some time on this, talking now about this particular verse, and then it talks then, of course, that this is the initiation of rain for 40 days and 40 nights. So this would be probably a good place to just start our discussion on the various phases of the flood and how long did it last. So how long did the flood last? Anybody in here know? Most commonly, you would probably hear 40 days and 40 nights, right? Most people will say, oh yeah, 40 days and 40 nights. I'm sure that would be the answer for most people that they would give. But as we see going through this, we'll see the flood actually lasts a lot longer than that. It actually lasts 371 days from beginning to end. And again, we'll cover that as we go through this. So the duration of the flood, we'll see as we go through this, starts on this date, ends 371 days later. So starting in Genesis 7:11, we've recorded again the beginning of the flood, the 600th year of Noah's life, and again on the 17th day of the second month, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, or were broken up, depending on the translations that you use. Floodgates of heavens are open, and the key word here in this passage is burst forth. This word burst forth basically is the Hebrew word baqa, which is B-A-Q-A. And this word means to tear open, to split open, to rip open or crack open. And I think this is a very fitting word for this event. I mean, this was not something gradually that happened. This was a violent event. Things were ripped apart. This would have been a release of energy that would have been quite literally earth-shaking. And so when this energy is released, it completely changes the Earth's geology. And we're going to talk about the amount of energy that would have been released today. So this energy release would be so significant that much of the Earth's features today will be explained by it. And also there would have been ample energy to even expel rocks and water out beyond Earth's atmosphere, out into outer space. And these rocks and water would then merge later to become comets and asteroids. So this marks day 0 of our flood. And we'll see that this explosion wherein the fountains of the great deep burst forth is basically an extremely large explosion. And extremely large explosions are often the result of a chain reaction. So it's a rapid sequence of stages where one stage occurs, triggers the next stage, and this next stage releases even more energy, and so forth, depending on how many stages there are. For example, a gun is fired by energy supplied to pull a trigger, and that in turn releases the energy stored in a compressed spring that accelerates a firing pin into a bullet, and it causes the bullet to explode, and it ignites the propellant inside the bullet that rapidly burns and generates gases that accelerate a bullet down the barrel of a gun. So this is a rapid sequence of events that leads to the firing of a bullet. Likewise, the explosion of a hydrogen bomb is the end result of a rapid series of smaller explosions. So first, a relatively tiny chemical explosion compresses nuclear fuel into what's called a supercritical mass. This produces an atomic explosion or a fission reaction. The heat then initiates what's called a thermonuclear or fusion reaction, much, much more energy than what it starts out to be. So these energy releases continue to build upon each other. So the Great Flood would have a similar sequence of events in order, and each event would then trigger the next event, resulting in a huge release of energy, a total release of energy. So we'll have 4 different energy sources that will be released during this process, much like the firing of a gun or the explosion of a hydrogen bomb. So the energy released by each of these first 3 sources is huge, but it's small compared to the total energy release when all of them are combined together. So each would trigger the next in sequence. So considering the total amount of energy released with all 4 combined, we can see that there was an amazing, an unbelievable amount of energy that could have produced not only all the effects of the flood that we're going to see, but will confirm that we could have launched rocks out into outer space. And there are dozens of evidences that confirm this. So these 4 sources of energy are listed here, and they release an astounding, literally earth-shaking amount of energy that accumulated in the subterranean waters before the flood. So all this energy is released when the powerful fountains of the great deep burst forth or basically explode. These 4 sources of energy would be something called tidal pumping. This has to do with tidal energy. We discussed this somewhat last week, due to the gravitational attraction of the moon, especially on the Earth, and the stretching of our crust, causing the waters in the trapped chambers below to heat up and become supercritical. So again, we're going to talk a little bit more about the amount of energy in supercritical water. It's astounding, the amount of energy that you'll find in this. Then we also see that there's chemical energy. Chemical energy comes from combustion in the supercritical water. And then we also have potential energy, which is basically residing in the pre-flood crust and the weight of that crust on top of the water. So there would have been a tremendous amount of energy because of that. And also nuclear energy. So we want to just look briefly at these 4 key energy sources. So again, tidal pumping we covered, Dr. Brown termed it this. Again, this the Earth's spin and gravitational attraction of the sun and the moon compressed and stretched the pillars on a daily basis. And this became so hot and so much pressure that this water became supercritical. And this would have been maintained up until the centuries, up until the beginning of the flood. So when the rupture of the crust begins, there's a tremendous drop in pressure and temperature. And when this happens, there's an explosion, basically. And again, we'll discuss this when we get to supercritical waters a little bit more. The second is from chemical energy, from likely combustion that would have happened in supercritical waters. So in other words, there may have been a burning or a fire in the subterranean waters. So supercritical water at very high pressures and temperatures will release oxygen, and if there's any fuel at all present, it will spontaneously ignite or rapidly burn or oxidize, creating heat in the process. So the effect of this burning and thermal heat related explosions in supercritical water has been observed and well documented in the characteristics of supercritical water when it's studied. So we can't say for sure exactly what fuels were present in the subterranean chambers, although the great dissolving capability of supercritical waters and the large volume of sponge-like rock that is dissolved and would be in contact with the supercritical water means that there was a lot of dissolved substances in this water trapped, in these waters. So some of these elements that were released would have had some combustive properties. And we can't observe this. We can only speculate on this, but that appears to be another source of energy. The third, of course, is potential energy, and this energy is basically due to the crust. So imagine that you have a 60-mile thick crust lying on top of about a mile thick water below. The pressure of all that weight squirted out through a narrow opening would have been kind of like a squirt gun. Or think of a garden hose. As you have a garden hose and you start adjusting the sprayer on the hose, the smaller you make the opening, the faster the water shoots out with more force. So at the very beginning, this rupture in the crust is relatively narrow, and the weight, of course, above that would basically be like a squirt gun or a fire hose or whatever analogy you want to use. You'd have a tremendous amount of pressure that would have shot this material up out of the chambers below up into Earth's atmosphere, and that causes the rain that comes down, and also provides energy to shoot water and elements out past the Earth's atmosphere. And we see this when we look now at asteroids. Again, we'll look at that a little bit, how asteroids form. And interestingly enough, they're finding now on asteroids, when they are able to get samples of asteroids, they're finding organic materials on asteroids. Organic materials would be living things, the remnants of living things on asteroids. Okay, so evolutionists will tell you what? That life was seeded here by asteroids, because they brought some kind of organic material to the Earth that somehow made it to the Earth and caused life to start on the Earth. This is one theory that the evolutionists come up with. I think a better answer to this is that the Earth is the source of this. Okay, if we have all this vegetation and organic material on the face of the Earth, when the fountains of the Great Deep burst forth, some of that swept up into our atmosphere out beyond and causes the creation of comets and asteroids. Well, that would have had organic material on it, right? It makes perfect sense to me. So a small opening in the crust would have caused a violent amount of pressure to shoot materials up from underneath the crust. And lastly, the fourth source of energy would be from nuclear energy, which would have occurred in the Earth's crust as the flood began. So as you recall, we talked earlier about one of the starting assumptions of the hydroplate theory, and that would be that at the end of the creation week, God says everything is exceedingly good or very good, right? So radioactive elements that are part of nuclear energy would not logically have been a part of the original creation, because radioactivity can be very harmful to humans, and so we wouldn't expect this to be part of the original created Earth. Rather, we will see that there are scientifically supported reasons that explain the origins of radioactive elements in the Earth's outer crust as a consequence of the flood. So as the flood began, stresses in the massive crust would have caused fluttering or movement in the crust, much like a flag in a very stiff wind, flutters. This fluttering of this crust, even though the crust is 60 miles thick, it's huge. So, over an extremely large area, it's not hard to see how there would have been some movement or flutter in the crust. And so this flutter in the crust causes huge piezoelectric voltages in the crust. So these are electrical charges, basically, kind of like lightning in the crust. And this huge amount of electrical surges produce magnetic forces that squeeze the nucleuses of certain atoms together, making them highly unstable. And so some of these would have decayed or quickly fissioned and decayed into various isotopes, and some of these would have been radioactive. So this starts to explain why do we have radioactive materials today? Okay, if God said everything's good at the end of the creation week, we shouldn't have had expected radioactive materials then. But this explains, explains logically how this could have happened. And it can be experimentally shown that powerful electric discharges that would have occurred during the Earth's crust during the flood could have produced Earth's radioactivity actually rather quickly. This would have also released gigantic amounts of heat, again, into the already supercritical waters, thus further increasing the energies in these waters even further. So this is a highly technical aspect of the hydroplate theory. There's a whole chapter in it in his latest version of the book. We're not going to touch on it now. It's far too deep. It's very technical. But for now, just realize that this would have also added a great amount of energy that would have been released when the fountains of the great deep burst forth. So once you realize that these four sources of likely energy are all working together at the onset of the flood, kind of like the firing of a gun or an explosion of an atomic bomb, you start to become aware maybe or have somewhat of an understanding of just how violent this would have been, this bursting forth of the great deep. So Dr. Brown has calculated that the energy release here would be roughly the equivalent of 5,000 trillion hydrogen bombs. Because I can't even imagine how much power that is, but we're talking about just a tremendous amount of energy. So I got to thinking, is this an indication of God's tremendous anger at the time and the sorrow that he probably expressed at the state of mankind just before the flood? I think this maybe is an indication of that. I don't know. I'm just kind of something I was thinking about, but I'll kind of leave you to think about that and contemplate that, just as we think about more about just this, how much energy would have been released at the onset of the flood here. So the hydroplate theory, I want to go over the basic parts of the hydroplate theory. We're going to return back and go through each one of these phases and the different things that happen during each of these phases in more detail. But I'm going to give you kind of like the mini lesson here. I'll go through the whole thing. This would be a great thing. You could probably talk to somebody else about hydroplate theory, because quite honestly, you could spend hours and hours and hours talking about this with somebody. But this will give you the basics of it. It's hard to compress it all into 5 minutes, but you can get something where you get a sense of just what's going on here and support it with scientifically sound principles. Cause and effects principles. So what we'll see here is that these cause and effect relationships will explain many of their strange, unusual features that are not adequately explained by supposed evolutionary processes over evolution's assumed billions of years timescales. Hydroplate theory rather will show that the first three main phases of the Great Flood occur over the time span of just a few months, or the first few months as the flood begins, and then some phases, some of the aspects of the last phase, which is called the recovery phase, continue even to today. So the four phases here are basically the rupture phase, the flood phase, the continental drift phase, and then the recovery phase. There's a little animation that shows you this bursting forth of the great deep and all this material getting ejected out into space. So the first phase is the rupture phase. Now, we showed this slide before, but I want to show it again here. And it's illustrated here when the fountains of the great deep burst forth, all in the same day. This is exactly what Scripture tells us here. The rupture phase only lasts a few hours or so. So we'll call this day 0. So This rupture phase is initiated when a deep initial crack occurs in the Earth's crust and the Earth's surface. Not sure exactly how that starts. It's probably a miraculous thing that God did, knowing full well what would happen in sequence after this happens. We can't be dogmatic about this. I don't want to rely on miracles to explain things, but there's so many miracles recorded in the Bible, it's not hard to imagine that this could have been something God initiated. So what follows again is a series of events based on cause and effect relationships. And again, the principles of science and physics will be used, and gravity, that explain all these unusual features of the Earth that we're going to cover. So watch now as this animation shows a crack racing around the Earth. So this is the pre-flood Earth here, with the small seas, pre-flood, much smaller than the seas and oceans we have today. So this would have raced around the whole Earth. And could this have happened all on one day, as Scripture says? So yes, when a tension crack forms, the high pressures in the chambers stress concentrations at each side of the crack, or each direction the crack would end up going, and would have quickly propagated the crack around the Earth in a great circle path, probably through the path of least resistance in the crust. And this again is recorded in Scripture in Genesis 7:11. It says, on the same day, all of the fountains of the great deep burst forth. That means all of this happens on one day, I mean, amazingly enough. So does this agree with scientific principles? Could this crack really encircle the Earth on the very same day? Well, you're probably not going to be surprised to hear that, yes, this can happen. The amazing amount of energy contained within the Earth from all these sources we just talked about would have increased to the point where this pressure would have been released when this crack occurs, and water would have started to squirt out, basically out of the cracks. And due to the increase in pressure that we would have experienced in the crust over the time before the flood starts, there would have been a great amount of stress in the crust. Kind of like, think about a balloon. As you inflate it, the surface of the balloon expands and becomes under more tension. Kind of the same thing happens with the crust here. So with all this pressure and all this heat and everything going on below, the crust is stretched. And eventually it snaps, kind of like a rubber band snaps. When you pull a rubber band and it breaks, that's kind of really exactly what's going on here. So this failure point starts with this microscopic crack. And within seconds, this crack would go all the way down to the subterranean chamber, following a path of least resistance. And this opening up of the crust would be sudden, and it would race around the Earth, probably completing its path in somewhere around 2 hours. Because stress in such cracks are concentrated on each end of the crack, this crack would have grown pretty rapidly. And calculations show that a tension crack in granite travels at approximately or nearly 3 miles per second. So we see this today. We observe this when large earthquakes occur, for example, and their ruptures travel through the earth or granite or solid rock at roughly 3 miles per second. So in this case, the rupture occurs in the crust, ensuing that the crack propagates this in two different directions. And this crack would have raced in both directions, circling the globe in about 2 hours, covering about 46,000 miles. So you may wonder also why the crack didn't stop. Why did the crack not continue? Why did the crack continue once the water pressure was relieved? So in other words, the opening up of the fountains below would have started to relieve pressure. So why did this crack keep going? It's trapped 60 miles below the surface. There would have been a sudden pressure drop immediately at the point of this initial rupture. However, even though intense pressure would drop rapidly at the location of the initial crack, the extremely high pressure in the subterranean waters was not only at this point, it was worldwide. So this pressure existed all over the globe. And this intense pressure, of course, was due to all these things we're talking about, especially the incredible amount of weight of the 60-mile crust above the waters and the forces of gravity. We just talked about that as a source of energy. So this crack would then propagate horizontally, sideways, out through the granite shell at a greater speed than the pressure drop in the water chamber, because the speed of sound in water is slower than the speed of sound in granite. So we just discussed that the speed of sound in granite is just around 3 miles, just a little bit short of 3 miles per second. But the speed of sound in water is only about a third of the speed of sound in granite. So the crack would always race ahead of this pressure drop, so allowing the crack to continue to occur. So imagine you're looking now at a cross section of the Earth. Here we've got the granite crust, the trapped subterranean waters, the mantle below. And watch this animation, as you'll see that the leading edge of the crack always races ahead of the crack in this animation. Here's the leading edge of the crack. You see high pressure here, but the low pressure is behind it. So it allows this pressure to still be there to continue this crack propagating. So the pressure drop, the leading edge of the crack always raced along far ahead of the water's pressure drop. So we'll see the granite separate long before it felt a drop in water pressure, allowing it to continue around the Earth until it comes together where it eventually stops. So this is why this crack continues to go on. So now I want you all to imagine that you're CSIs, okay? Everybody watch the show CSI, okay? Or CSI, you know what it means, right? Crime Scene Investigation. CSI, of course, stands for Crime Scene Investigation, which is a field of what's called forensics, which is involved in the collection and analysis of evidence of a crime scene, at a crime scene. And so forensics refers to tests or techniques that are used in connection with the detection of a crime or an accident, different things. They want to piece together what happened, what caused this, how did this happen? For example, I want you to imagine that you're investigating an auto accident in order to determine what happened during the crash. An automobile accident scene investigation involves attempts to determine the causes of a collision by documenting evidence that's collected at the scene, right? Like the vehicle damage. Okay, where was the damage on the vehicle? Was it on the front or the side, this sort of thing? We want to look at skid marks, right? Did somebody hit the brakes and then skid into a car? These sorts of things are all things you look at. What about debris? When two cars would hit each other, there'd be a certain amount of debris that likely would go in multiple directions. So by analyzing all this physical evidence, we then want to go and say, okay, how did this accident happen? What were the root causes of the accident? How did this accident occur? So in much the same way, we want to consider the Earth, and even in fact some aspects of the Moon and even out of the solar system, as a huge accident scene. Basically, the Earth is an accident scene. And so we want to now go back and examine this current state by observing what we now see in the present. We can't go back and see this happen in the past. It was a one-time event. But we can piece things together using logical principles of science and physics, and we can come to what we hope to be the cause of the accident. What caused this accident to happen? So what I want you to now is put on your trench coats, put on your funny-looking deerstalker caps, grab your curved pipes and magnifying glasses, and we'll investigate this crime scene. So here's our crime scene. This basically is our crime scene. This is the current Earth. This is a map of the current Earth. Now, of course, it's been flattened out so you can see the entire Earth. But I want to now, again, determine, using our CSI investigative capabilities, looking for the right word here, our skills basically to determine just how this Earth ended up this way. So what you'll see here in this map, basically in yellow, are today's continents. We see South America, North America, we see Africa, Europe, Asia, and over here's where China is, and Australia is down here. The blue sections are the ocean floors. So the ocean floors, we see this is what's called the mid-oceanic ridge, what we're going to be discussing. This is a result of the flood. What caused this mountain chain to form, this huge, absolutely huge mountain chain, by far bigger than any mountain chain on Earth. Also, what causes the mountains to form along the front edges of South America and North America. We see a huge mountain chain that goes from Alaska all the way down through Central America, all the way down to the tip of South America. And we see also that the mountain chain up here is much bigger and thicker than it is down here. But there's a mountain chain here as well. So what caused all that? So again, we'll look at this in more detail as we see, but this is a map of this current geography of the Earth. So the rupture phase, of course, occurs with such a force that materials are launched from the Earth. There's also a large amount of debris that's shot out during the rupture phase, and some of this actually hits the moon, causing cratering on the moon. Again, this is a Reader's Digest version of Hydroplate Theory, but it explains comets and asteroids and meteorites, and it explains why the moon is peppered. Looks like it got shot with a shotgun, basically, especially on the backside. So we see this as all kinds of different things. And we just mentioned that asteroids contain organic matter. So that's a good indication that they probably came from the Earth itself. It's the same kind of organic matter we find on Earth today. And using some modeling, we can even predict where the crack started and where it ended. So up there in the upper left here appears to be where this crack initiated. Now again, remember, this is pre-flood, so there's the topography of the Earth doesn't look like this today, back at the time of the flood. But it looks like it's up in the eastern Siberian Sea, and again, we'll see in a second why that's where it appears to have started. So the opening up of this crack, we'll see after the rupture phase, is the beginning of the flood phase, which of course is the second phase of the flood. So the rupture phase only lasts one day, basically. It's very short. So where all this fountains of the great deep, again, it all happens on one day, all burst forth on one day. So the second phase of the flood occurs, and because of all of the sediments that would have been trapped in the subterranean chambers due to the heat and the dissolving power of subterranean supercritical water, that would have all been swept up to the surface of the Earth. So now we've got the surface water of the Earth that was there pre-flood. We now have it combining with most of the water from the subterranean chambers. And in this process, it sweeps up rocks and debris and all kinds of sediments and brings them to the surface. So this tremendous amount of sediments that are brought up to the surface, with now the Earth completely covered with water. And remember that Genesis says that the Earth was covered with water. The highest mountaintops were covered by 15 cubits. So all the surfaces of the Earth are covered. So there's a process called liquefaction that explains how the stratolayers are laid down across our Earth today. So when we look at the land masses, the yellow masses here, realize that about 70 to 72 or 3% of the land today is covered by sedimentary layers. So there's some places where granite is exposed, but there's deep, sometimes miles deep, of layers that are stacked on top of each other, kind of like layers on a cake, a birthday cake. Look at the Grand Canyon is a great example of that. You have layer upon layer upon layer stacked on top of each other. These layers don't stop at the Grand Canyon. They go out for tens of thousands of square miles over virtually all of North America. And this is just an example. You can go and look at, just do a Google search for stratolayers, and you will see stratolayers literally everywhere, all over the world, these stratolayers. So you start thinking about, how could these have formed? Well, there's a process called liquefaction, which basically, if there's motion or movement in the waters, and all the sediments are trapped or in the waters, rather quickly, heavier parts of the sediments will start to settle to the bottom, lighter parts of the sediments will start to rise, and with all this water rushing across the face of the Earth, when the fountains of the great deep burst forth, it would have swept up trees and animals and anything in its pathway, basically, would have become all jumbled up in this huge blender, basically, like a mixing blender that brought all these things together. And as liquefaction starts to separate now these into the stratolayers, because of buoyancy of certain types of animals and plants, they would settle into separate layers, sometimes between layers, becoming sandwiched in between layers, creating our strata layers that we see today. We'll see some very interesting aspects of some of these strata layers and how they would have formed. Like the Earth previous to the flood was mostly land. I mean, it was maybe 70-75% land, kind of the reverse of what we see today. And because of the mist rising, as we see in Genesis 2:6, from the surface of the earth to water the surface of the earth, this is all over the earth. So that would have created huge amounts of vegetation in the 1656 years since creation. So now we see there's massive amounts of plant material that's been trapped into strata layers. We see coal seams, for example, which are decaying plants that are sometimes hundreds of feet thick. It's just incredible how much vegetation it would have taken to produce all that. So as this rupture continues, it starts to also form what are called continental shelves. And you'll see this as something else that's an aspect of the ocean as we look closely. And again, this slide doesn't really show it. But all around the Earth, the land masses go out and then into the ocean a little bit, and then there's a sudden drop-off. That's called the continental shelf, into the deep part of the ocean. This is all over the world. And what would cause that? So basically we had a 60-mile high cliff at the beginning of the rupture phase that would have now spread apart, basically, once we go into the third phase of the hydroplate theory, which is basically the continental drift phase. And we will see that these continental shelves are formed as a process of these plates spreading apart. And the formation of the mid-oceanic ridges also occurs at the end of the flood phase and right at the beginning of the continental drift phase. So as so much material is eroded away and removed from what's below, the mantle below, it's kind of like there's a spring underneath there, and you remove, there's a lot of weight that's pressing down on that. All of a sudden that's removed. And what that causes is the mantle below, this is below the subterranean waters, would have suddenly sprung up and would have caused these ocean ridges, which roughly follow the path of the crack as it goes around the Earth. So we'll see later too, as we discuss more about the mid-oceanic ridges, that even though this is a huge mountain chain, the characteristics of how this mountain chain is arranged is completely different than any mountain chain on Earth, on land. Okay? So we'll see that there are cracks that run along the ridge and across the ridge, perpendicular and on an axis to the ridge. No mountains on land look anything like this. There's aspects of this that indicate that it was pushed up from underneath, and the rocks would have split apart in two different directions as the crust suddenly buckles up. So this upward springing upward of the mantle below is what causes these mid-oceanic ridges to form in a very distinct way. Again, completely different than any other mountains on Earth. Again, we'll talk about this a little later, but this is completely at odds with what's called plate tectonics. And I'm going to save a discussion of plate tectonics until we get to looking at the aspects of the mid-oceanic ridges. But plate tectonics is the dominant geological explanation for how these ridges form. They propose that basically molten rock below the mantle comes up at these ridges and does something called seafloor spreading, which causes the floor to push up and outward. And then as that floor spreads at about the rate of as fast as your fingernail grows, it would have then pushed this plate underneath other plates, and something I call subduction. We'll show you reasons why plate tectonics doesn't work, because the mid-oceanic ridges wouldn't look this way if there was seafloor spreading, and there's no way plates can dive under other plates. I mean, well, again, I heard the bell. I know we're out of time, but we'll get to that next week.